All right, Ainsley, are you ready to go?
Yeah.
Okay. Hello, everybody. I just wanted to welcome you all. Thank you for coming along. Glad you're here to check out some of the amazing work that Ainsley's been doing now for the past 2.5 years. She started up in the lab in 2018 in the fall with a BS in field biology from University of Wisconsin River Falls, and it's been a really big pleasure for me to have her. To work with her. She's extremely hardworking, focused, independent, and intelligent scientist, and it's been. I'll be sad to see her go, but I'm excited for where she goes after this. She's been able to go to work with dozens of different land managers all over the region, and part of what she'll be talking about today is sharing her 2019 survey with you. And there'll be time for questions at the end of the 50-minute talk. So feel free to put some questions into the chat or stick around at the end. And I hope you all enjoy it. So please join me in welcoming Ainsley's talk on vegetation surveys in southern Minnesota prairies, management of invasive species, and future directions.
Thank you very much, Dr. Kaproff, and thank you everyone for coming to tune in this morning. It's wonderful to see you all. So, as Dr. Kaproff mentioned, I would like to take just a few minutes here to talk to you about one of the projects that we've been working on in Dr. Kaproff's lab and that I've been working on. So, I'll start off by saying that I would really like to thank our 2019 field team, which was Kyle Barnes and Patrick Carver, who were very intricately involved in the collection of this data, particularly during our August surveys. And just as a quick aside here, this was an excellent picture of poor Kyle trying to find the road when we got lost in kind of a forest of buckthorn on one of our sites. The only way out was to find high ground. So I'd just like to do a little bit of an introduction for why we were working on this project and why it's so important. And one of the reasons is that Prairie is one of the more iconic landscapes that we see in the Midwestern region, and particularly in Minnesota. However, historically, there was a lot more prairie than what we do see in the modern day. Minnesota's prairie is now covering less than 1% of what the historical range used to be. And unfortunately, because of that, we're looking at prairie that's often fragmented and often potentially degraded as well. And because of that, we have real concerns about potential issues with that habitat quality and how those prairies are actually doing. Now, pardon me, sometimes it's a little bit difficult to really keep in mind just the staggering scale of that loss. So I'd like to draw your attention to this Minnesota Prairie Conservation Plan figure. And what I'd like to draw your attention to specifically here are two colors on the largest map on this screen. And those two colors are that bright yellow and then that bright red. And what we're looking at here is the difference between a prairie that was historically recorded in the state of Minnesota during the public land survey. So earlier on, around 1908 and back through 1847. That would be the yellow cover on this map. What we have as of around 2017 is the cover that's in red. So as you can see, that is a significant loss in prairie cover in the state of Minnesota. When I'm talking about prairie, there's actually two different categories that we were looking at throughout this study. And the first one that I'd like to talk about are remnant prairies. So with remnant prairies, what I'm talking about here are prairies that have been prairie historically for as far back as records go. So as far as we know, the land that we're looking at now that is prairie has been prairie for as long as records go back. The nice thing about this type of habitat is that we're working with unaltered land in that it was never turned over to cropland it wasn't destroyed or altered in order to create something new. Ideally then, what we should be looking at is as close to the historical ideal as what we can find in the modern day. The other type of prairie that we're interested in are restored prairies. And there are two different options for getting restored prairies. The first one is that we're dealing with land that was historically prairie, and for one reason or another was either altered or turned over to another land type or somehow degraded. And after some time, it's been returned, or is presently in the process of being returned to prairie. The other path is that this is land that wasn't historically prairie before, but managers saw potential for a high quality prairie on that site, and it's being turned over to prairie presently. This is really important because not just in the state of Minnesota, but the Midwest, there is a lot of interest in prairie habitat. And what we're really interested in is this idea of prairie conservation in the state of Minnesota. And we know that there is strong support both through the government and through private individuals who are really interested in creating more prairie and helping to keep the prairie that exists in Minnesota in high quality. And for instance, in just three programs, the Conservation Reserve Program, or CRP, the Conservation Reserve Enhancement Program, or CREP, and Reinvest in Minnesota, or IM, just in those three of the programs that exist, there's over $700 million that have been invested, which is a significant investment, not just in the funds, but also in man hours and also in just the general effort that it takes in order to work with these landscapes. And as an extension of that, we're really interested in how best can we make use of this investment and how can we help managers assess management needs on their sites, which really led into why we were interested in doing this project. The actual sites that we ended up visiting here were pretty spread out in this southern part of Minnesota here. We ended up visiting 22 distinct locations, and as several of those locations had multiple prairies on site, there were actually 31 prairies that were surveyed during the June through July period in 2019. There was also a subset of 11 of those original 31 that were completed by Kyle Barnes during an August follow-up survey. Of those sites, there were 10 that were privately owned, 2 that were owned by the Nature Conservancy, or TNC, and 19 that were owned by the Minnesota Department of Natural Resources, or MNDNR. On a map, this is what that looks like. So the 4 different colors that correspond on this map are tied into something called ECS, or Ecological Classification Surveys, or system, pardon me. And I'll be talking about that a little bit more shortly because it's important for how we got some of the metrics that we worked with. But what I really want to highlight here is that all of our prairies were in the southern part of the state of Minnesota, and we were looking specifically for dry prairies, which ties into a specific part of the classification system that we had to use as part of our survey metric. All of our restored prairies here are designated with these kind of purple flowers, and then remnant prairies that we visited are shown in these blue star shapes. And what I'm talking about when I'm talking about prairies specifically is a really characteristic mixture of native forbs and grasses, and kind of a characteristic lack of heavy tree and dead shrub cover. So as an example of what ideally that would look like, on the screen here, there's a photo of that River Terrace SNA, or Scientific and Natural Area, which is one of the prairies that we ended up visiting. Here, and that serves as an excellent example. We have native forbs, we have a lot of different types of grasses in here, and there's not that really dense shrub or tree cover. The other thing I would like to draw your attention to is that the prairies that we ended up visiting spanned kind of all over the parts of southern Minnesota. So we were visiting several different scientific and natural areas. We visit a couple of different state parks, as well as privately owned lands. And as probably a better example, what I'd like to draw your attention to here is this is an excellent example of what a prairie should look like. We have a lot of absolutely beautiful flowers here, specifically several different types of beer tongue flowers and then spiderwort, as well as native grass cover. And I'm afraid I don't have a video for you, and I wish that I did, because this particular prairie was absolutely gorgeous. And on top of just the vegetation community that was incredibly diverse, we saw native pollinators, we saw birds, there were all kinds of different wildlife present. And as an extension of that, there were lots of small burrowing animals. And you may be able to see where I'm going with this, but if I had a video for you, I wish I could show. Every once in a while you hear a yelp and then one of us would disappear into the flowers because there were some holes available because of those small animals. Strongly recommend good boots for this type of survey work. And I digress. One thing that we noticed when we were actually on these sites is, for a variety of reasons, and in all likelihood, heavily due to the really good quality soils, a lot of the prairies that we visited were surrounded by agricultural land. And this Langham Prairie Scientific and Natural Area is an excellent example of that. There is a single access path to get into this prairie from the road, surrounded by privately owned agricultural land, and then in the middle of several different fields, we have this gorgeous prairie that serves as kind of an oasis in the middle of it all. And when I'm talking about prairies and prairie surveys, like what does that actually look like? And what we were doing is actually a timed meander, which is detailed by the vegetation monitoring tool that was adopted by the LCCMR. And that is described by Bonin and Galadowicz. What this actually means is that it's a timed walk, and the idea is to cover as much time, or pardon me, as much cover on the site as possible, while creating a master list of every single species of plant found on that site. How much time is actually spent collecting a master list of these species is dependent on several factors. So the base time is 30 minutes. However, if there are different vegetation zones, if it's a larger site, or if any of the surveyors have to move between areas or pause because of time needed to ID a species, that time ends up increasing. So for instance, for a site that is less than 5 acres, there's one meander with a base time of 30 minutes. It is highly unlikely, at least in our surveying, to spend only 30 minutes on a site doing our surveys. For sites between 5 and 59 acres, that would translate to 2 meanders. And this pattern continues in this way until 10 meanders for sites that are larger than 300 acres. So if we have an example site that is kind of rectangular shaped here, and we know that it is 80 acres, according to that metric, we know that we have to do 3 meanders on site with a base time of 1.5 hours. In order to best cover that site and get the best representative master list of every plant species found, what we did is we would cut these areas up into kind of separate quadrants so that each person was focusing on a specific area at a time to cover as much cover on that ground as possible. On this side of the screen here, we can see we've got our 2 meanderers who found a plant that we weren't particularly sure about, and we're consulting on species ID. It looks just a little bit ominous there, but that particular rainstorm was there and gone in less than 10 minutes. On Glen Prairie Scientific and Natural Area. The end goal for our data collection on each of these sites was to create a master list. So for each prairie we visited, we had a list with every species of plant we found on that site, as well as cover class information and some basic site information. As part of the site information during that period and for a while afterwards, we were collecting management information, which was put into 3 categories: mechanical, chemical, and then fire or prescribed burning. And the idea with these management categories is that different types of management were going to fall under these categories. So for mechanical, that would include things like hand pulling or mowing. Chemical we designated as the use of any herbicides on these sites. And then prescribed burns are just intentionally set fires used to help control different plant species on these sites. We also collected information on several other areas, including the area, invasive and non-native plant species found on these sites, the overall species richness, and then of course we put them into their site histories, so whether they counted as a restoration or a remnant prairie. We also used something called the TNC, or the Nature Conservancy Resilient Landscape Tool, which I'll be talking about shortly, as well as looking at the information collected by Kyle Barnes during his August follow-up surveys. What we were thinking going into this project were several things, in that we would expected to see that restored prairies would have lower invasive species presence and comparatively higher native species presence compared to remnant prairies. We also thought that remnant prairies would have greater phylogenetic diversity. And while I'll talk about this more in depth in just a few minutes, phylogenetic diversity is one of the metrics that correlates with species richness, and then it stands for essentially biodiversity, so how diverse the plant community is on these sites. We also thought that larger prairie area would correlate with lower invasive species presence, and that the different management categories that we set would have significant effects on the invasive species for both of these prairie categories. Now, I had referenced earlier in talking about the 4 colors on our site map and talking about the ECS, or ecological classification system. And I'd like to just address that quickly because it was a really important part of our study. And essentially what the ecological classification system is intended to do is to describe progressively smaller, more uniform areas in these different ecological areas. So what we were interested in looking at our master lists is we were comparing them to native plant communities that we would have expected to see based on the classification by the state of Minnesota. And as an example of that, there are several different classifications here. And it goes from more inclusive to progressively less inclusive. And that these 4 general outlines for tallgrass aspen parklands, down through eastern broadleaf forest and prairie parkland describe a lot of areas that aren't necessarily represented throughout. For instance, you can have prairies in the eastern broadleaf forest province, and you can have more forested areas in the prairie parkland province. But what we were particularly interested in is the upland prairie system, which is kind of outlined in red here. If you were to look at one of those field guides, what you would end up seeing is a description of what each of these different areas looks like. So for instance, we have UPS 13 here as an example, which is detailing the upland prairie system in the southern floristic region. And it has several site descriptions for what you would expect to see on one of these sites, as well as indicator species and other areas that would be similar in appearance. So for instance, they're referencing UPS 23 or southern mesic prairie, which is considered to be similar in structure, but there's a different makeup for herbaceous species composition. And we need to know that information in order to work with 2 of our metrics. And the first one that I would like to talk about is the percent PNV. So the percent of natural vegetation found on these sites. The picture that's on this slide is an excerpt from one of those species lists. And what essentially each of those are a representative list of different species that you would expect to see based on the system and then the NPC class, or the native plant community class. Pardon me. So for instance, if we were going to calculate this, say that we were on a site where there were 20 total plant species. And we know, working through those classifications, that we're looking at UPS 13. So it's an upland prairie in the southern floristic region, and is categorized as a southern dry prairie. What we would need to do is to compare the master species lists that we found along with the representative species list that's detailed for that area. And then we want to see how many, where there's overlap. So what species are found on our site that are also considered to be native vegetation according to those species lists. So for instance, if we're looking at white and purple prairie clover, and we know that we're working with UPS 13, white prairie clover is not considered native vegetation for that system, where purple prairie clover is. After we go through that process, say we find 6 out of the 20, which would translate to a 30% native vegetation score. Now, because these are representative species lists and they do not include every single possible species that would be considered native to these areas, this is a somewhat conservative outcome for these sites. The other score that we were interested in based off of the system is the composite invasive species abundance score, which is calculated in a similar way, in that we're also still comparing our master lists from our site to a set list of invasive species for the state of Minnesota. As part of our data collection, when we were actually on sites, including all of the site information and the actual invasive species, we also were using the detailed ocular guide on the side here to set a percentage cover for approximately how much of the site was covered by this species, which for this metric has to coincide with a cover class and a midpoint in order to get the invasive species abundance score. As an example, say on the site the only invasive species we found was reedy canary grass, which we can see on the state's list is considered an invasive species according to the DNR. When we were on site, the ocular guide detailed that it was found in 7%. Because it's 7%, it's falling within a 5 to 25% range, which means that it's within cover class 2. The midpoint for that cover class is 15%. And if that is the only invasive species that was found on site, it is the sum of those midpoints that gives us our Thesis score. So the Thesis score for that site would be 15%. And I had mentioned I was going to talk a little bit more about phylogenetic diversity too. And the phylogenetic diversity measure that we were using in this study is phase phylogenetic diversity, or a distance. So what we're interested in is looking at essentially the evolutionary background for the species that we found on site in the idea of a tree of life. So as an example of phylogeny, this figure on the side here is part of Faith and Richards from 2012. And ideally what we want to see when we're thinking about phylogenetic diversity is we want to see a large spread or a lot of different species with different evolutionary backgrounds. So we don't necessarily want to see a lot of species that are really closely related, like A and B or B and C. We want to see more of a spread because it helps correlate to more of a diverse plant community. And the last thing that I would like to talk to you about for our data collection was our Nature Conservancy resilient land mapping scores. This is a significant project that the Nature Conservancy has been working on for several years. And this is actually an excerpt of their the base map for their entire project. So as you can see from this, they've covered an extensive amount of territory in the United States, but they're not completely done yet. There's still some areas that aren't filled in, like these gray areas. But the idea behind this resilient land mapping tool is that there's supposed to be 3 metrics that help describe how resilient that site is to several different options. And the 3 scores that we see are resilience, landscape diversity, and local connectedness. So essentially what we're interested in is the ability of a site to withstand change while keeping key ecological functions, how diverse the surrounding area is, and how connected each of these areas is to other natural areas. So for instance, we were interested in a site near Afton, and this is an example. And how this tool works is that each of the sites of interest were covered with GIS polygons. And based on that, there are calculations that this site will do that will tell you what each of those scores are based on the data for how resilient and what the coverage is down to least resilient for each of these sites. Pardon me. So for this example, what we see for outcomes is that this site scored really pretty average. It's not doing particularly well compared to other areas that are similarly arranged, but it's not doing worse either. And each of these scores is what we were interested in using for our data. What we ended up finding were some really pretty interesting results. And I'd like to talk about our phylogeny first. So, pardon me, our phylogeny was, pardon me, our phylogeny was pruned down or made smaller based off of the Smith and Brown 2018 seed plant phylogeny, which had several 100,000 members, which was unfortunately just a little bit too large for what we were going to use. So we pruned this down to cover the species that we found during our surveys, and that was 374 species, which looks like this figure on the side, which is a fan type or circular arrangement of all of the species that we found during our survey. And we were interested in seeing, first of all, tying back to our original question of whether or not there were significant differences between our remnant and restored prairie types tied back to phylogenetic diversity. So essentially, how diverse are the plant communities, and are there significant differences based on the final site history? And what we found is this does not appear to be the case. We did not find any significant differences in phylogenetic diversity values between remnant and restored prairies. Moreover, it's pretty interesting that we did not find these differences. We were also interested in seeing whether or not this diversity correlated to our species richness and whether or not this was tied to our invasive species. So what we would expect to see is that our phylogenetic diversity would be correlated with species richness for both of our surveys periods. And what we found is that there is a strong correlation where larger or increasing species richness ties to higher phylogenetic diversity values, which we would really like to see because it helps influence or it helps tell us how diverse these sites are. Moreover, we found a trend towards a significant correlation with our August species richness. However, this species richness score was detailing both native and invasive species, and there was some concern that some of this diversity that we would potentially be seeing would be due to invasive species presence on these sites. In order to see whether that was the case, we tested against our invasive species score. And what we found is that there was no correlation between the phylogenetic diversity on these sites and the invasive species scores that we found, which indicates to us that there is not a correlation between our invasive species and our phylogenetic diversity score, which is what we would want to see. We want to see that diversity because of native diversity on these sites, not because there are invasive species kind of artificially inflating it. Moreover, we were also interested, pardon me, quick summary first, that overall we saw that phylogenetic diversity was showing a strong correlation with species richness and a trend towards a significant increase with our August surveys and a positive correlation. But that was not due to invasive species presence on these sites. We were also interested in seeing whether there was phylogenetic diversity tied to specific management regimes. And we looked at both the frequency and the years since each of these management types. So mechanical, chemical, and then prescribed burning between 2009 and then the end of the growing season in 2019. And what we found is of those three metrics, the only positive correlation that we found, or the only significant correlation that we found, I should say, was tied to prescribed burn frequency. And what we saw is increasing the frequency of these prescribed burns during that 2009 to 2019 timeframe had a positive correlation with increasing phylogenetic diversity. So we would end up seeing more phylogenetic diversity with more prescribed burns on each of these sites. Moreover, we also checked to see whether or not the area of these sites was going to have a significant effect on phylogenetic diversity. And we did find a significant correlation between increasing the area of a site and the diversity scores for phylogenetic diversity. But I would just kind of like to point out with this is that unfortunately we weren't able to survey many of these larger area sites. So in order to see whether this pattern continued, we would need to do more surveying on larger sites. We also tested against each of the Nature Conservancy metric scores. And what we found is of those three, the resiliency, the landscape diversity, and then local connectedness, is that the only one that showed a trend towards significance was local connectedness. So how connected these scores were to other natural sites around them led to an increase in their phylogenetic diversity scores. Our implications for what we found from that is that of all of the variables that we tested connected to these, the frequency of prescribed burns we think is important. The area of the site has the potential to be, but it would necessitate further testing. And then potentially the connection between each of these sites and then other areas, other natural areas around them can also be important for this diversity. We were also interested in our original two metrics. So our percent of natural vegetation, as well as our invasive species abundance scores. And there are two of these figures, and I'd like to draw your attention to just a couple of things. So this first is talking about our June and July surveys specifically. And what this figure is showing is the natural vegetation against invasive species abundance. And how this is organized is that each site here for each of our 31 sites is set up based on whether it is a remnant or a restoration. So our blue kind of snowflake is the remnants, and then the dots are our restorations. And each of these are compared against each other to get our median lines here, which are just the medians for our data sets. So each of these median lines, so the median for percent natural vegetation is around 22.72, and that our invasive species median was 19. By putting these median lines onto this figure, what we've done is essentially separate each of our sites based on an approximation for their quality. So in the lower corner here, when we're talking about our high quality sites, they're designated that because they have a higher native vegetation score and lower invasive species presence on those sites. There are two options for medium quality sites, in that there can be high native vegetation and high invasive species. There can also be low native vegetation and low invasive species. And for a lower quality site, what we would expect to see would be low native vegetation, but then also high invasive species. And what I'd kind of like to draw your attention to is that we've got that median line for percent natural vegetation at 22.72. But during the August surveys that Kyle Barnes did, please look at where the median line is for natural vegetation. Now all of a sudden it's about at 43. So there's been a significant increase here in natural vegetation scores, which also coincides with an increase in species richness that we found between our June and July scores and our August surveys. Moreover, we were interested in seeing whether or not these percent natural vegetation coincided to any kind of a difference between remnant and restored. And what we found is that there was a significant difference in natural vegetation found on these sites according to their site history, which was an interesting finding, particularly since we had that increase in species richness too. We also found there's a significant difference in site ownership. So there's a difference between whether the sites were owned by private individuals and whether they were owned by some sort of a state agency, like the Nature Conservancy or the Minnesota DNR. And this we found specific to percent PMV scores during the August subset surveys that occurred later in our 2019 field season. Overall, what we ended up finding was that August surveys had higher species richness, and beyond that, they had higher native species scores than what we found during our June and July surveys. Moreover, restored prairies had significantly higher percent PMV scores, native vegetation, but we did not see any differences associated with our invasive species abundance scores, which was interesting. We also saw a trend towards a significant increase in our August natural vegetation scores for public sites, but we did not see a similar pattern in our June and July surveys. Then, because we were interested in our invasive species, there were 8 major invasive species that we found during our surveys periods. We wanted to see if there were specific relationships potentially tied to each of those species individually. And of those 8 species, we ended up finding 3 that had significant relationships. The first was for white sweet clover. And what we found is that while there wasn't any kind of a correlation with prescribed burn, or the year since the last prescribed burn, what we did see was that the year since the last mechanical disturbance or mechanical management and the year since the last chemical management did have significant effects on how much land was covered by white sweet clover on these prairies. And what we found is the longer that it had been since one of these management types had been done, we saw more white sweet clover, which was interesting, and it helps illustrate that there are benefits to doing management more regularly. We also saw that yellow sweet clover was present in potentially larger amounts based on how large a site got. But again, this is an example where we would have to do more larger site testing in order to see whether this pattern continued, because we did not, unfortunately, have the opportunity to sample more of these larger scale sites. And then during the August surveys, what we actually found is that Horiolisum was present in smaller cover, but it covered less of these prairie sites if there is higher August species richness, which kind of ties into what we would expect to see based on some existing literature. Overall, what we found was that there is the potential for species-specific results to some of these really specific variables, like different management types in the area of these sites. But for some of these patterns, we would need to do more surveying in order to see whether these patterns were supported, not only on a larger number of sites, but on a larger number of larger scale sites. Moreover, some of our management analyses were more broad, so it's possible that there is some fine detail that was not represented here. And then I would like to talk to you for just a few minutes about what we found working with our Nature Conservancy, our TNC metrics. So our resiliency, our landscape diversity, and then our local connectedness scores. And what we found was pretty interesting in that there was a significant difference for all three of these scores tied to our site history. So we found that the landscape diversity, so how diverse the landscapes around these sites were, differed significantly based on whether the sites were remnant and whether they were restorations. We saw the same pattern further supported in local connectedness. So how connected each of these sites were to other natural areas around them, right? Or kind of the degree to which they were fragmented or not fragmented. And then finally, we were working with our resiliency scores. So how able each of these sites are to withstand change over time and still in order to keep their biodiversity as well as provide the key ecological functions that they need to. What we found was, again, a significant difference between restored and remnant prairies. Overall, we saw that our restorations scored significantly higher in all three of our Nature Conservancy metrics, which again measure each of these sites' ability to withstand change while retaining biodiversity and ecological functions that are critical, as well as their ability to withstand climatic shifts over time. They also show nearby microhabitats, as well as topographic and microclimatic conditions around each of these sites. And finally, the degree to which each of these sites is fragmented or kind of isolated from other natural sites around them. Overall, what we learned from this study is that we believe one survey is going to be incredibly insufficient to capture much of the diversity found in the southern Minnesota prairies. Right, when and how often these surveys are done is going to tie into whether or not there are species that are omitted and whether or not an accurate depiction of the plant community is going to be represented by these surveys. Moreover, we did all of our surveys within one field season, and it seems likely that this snapshot in time approach, where we only looked at these surveys at one specific point in time, is probably going to underrate site quality. We also feel that prescribed burning is important for enhancing our native species richness and our phylogenetic diversity. But we did find it difficult to find a single cause or potentially a single preventative measure or management technique to try and reduce invasive species presence on these invasive sites. Moreover, we only found a few significant differences between remnant and restored prairies. That was not on the scale that what we had expected in terms of site quality, but there are significant differences that the Nature Conservancy metrics really did illustrate. Moreover, we feel that that Nature Conservancy resilient land mapping tool has a lot of potential as a tool not only to select sites for potential restorations and quality work, but it also has a lot of important potential for helping inform management decisions on these sites. Overall, we feel that our study illustrates the importance of monitoring these prairies and these sites, both remnant and restored prairies, and it provides an argument for increased surveying as well as keeping detailed records for each of these prairies. We would really like to thank people who were absolutely instrumental both during and after and just throughout this entire project, particularly the Many Rivers chapter of the Prairie Enthusiasts, as well as Jim and Catherine Bonnerhar for all of their support. We would also like to thank the Minnesota Department of Natural Resources and the Nature Conservancy for their help both with site selection and allowing surveying, as well as this university and the Department of Biological Sciences. I would particularly like to thank my committee, Dr. Kaproth, Dr. Ruland, and Dr. Worsel, and the field team that made surveying during 2019 really fun, as well as help collect a lot of data. So thank you all very much for coming to tune into this presentation this morning. Are there any questions that I can answer?
Feel free to raise your hand, ask questions, or put in questions into the chat. Thank you very much, Ainsley. That was great.
Hi, Ainsley. Thank you so much. Yeah, this is super cool. I'm still always learning more about prairie and like kind of the unfortunate consequence that humans have on the natural landscape. Oops. Do you have historical data of like that invasive species metric was really attractive to me as like, if you built that, or my video's mirrored, so I'll try and go opposite. If you built that and it like grew over time, you could make like to me, it looked like really cool, like how like cancer cells kind of take over an area of the body, and it kind of explodes into like, now it's 100%. So kind of more of a comment, but I was really excited by the data, so thank you. Yeah.
Thank you.
And yeah, actually I should ask, yeah, do you have like over time data of like invasive species, like richness as it goes, going the opposite way again?
I think for a lot of the cases, like this is some of the first surveys for many of these sites. So it's kind of an understudied region. So yeah, it would be great to have historical surveys. We do have a couple in the region, but not anything more than like 1 or 2 sites that have something going back into the 40s or 60s. Yeah, so there's not too many snapshots that we have.
Probably pretty hard too. Like you described, there's pitfalls in like the prairies sometimes, and you're like, just fall right in. That's awesome. That's awesome. Yeah.
Ainsley, I have a question for you. What would be the next step in this research? What would you want to see next?
Well, what I would really like to see would be kind of a follow-up. So visiting each of these prairies over either on an annual basis or an every other year basis, because as you're both just referencing, we don't have a lot of that historical kind of baseline data to work with on a lot of these prairies. And it would be nice to try and set that up over time to see whether or not what we found in this kind of snapshot study would be what we would find in another year or 5 years from now, or whether the composition of these plant communities or the invasive species kind of shifts, or if this was kind of a representative snapshot in time for them.
Hey, Ainsley, I'm wondering about those phylogenetic diversity scores. Are those just like the average distance of all the plants? Is that how you created those?
Right, the Faith's phylogenetic diversity that we calculated, just a moment. for these was the distance between each of the different species in our actual phylogeny. So the distance of the branches between for each of them, pardon me.
Yeah, it was like the first slide that I'm asking about.
Yeah.
So.
Yeah. Yeah, this one. So we were interested in where these numbers are. So the 5, 4, 2, and 1. What we're looking at is the distance for the branches between each of these species on their position in the tree of life.
So something I'm thinking there about the difference between restored and the remnant stuff is one of the ideas in doing those restorations is selecting groups from different guilds. And I'm wondering if the relationship that you found would change if maybe you just looked inside of a guild. I'm just wondering if you're getting swamped out by using the entire phylogeny by the large distances that happen between those guilds, if that makes sense.
Right, potentially. I think that would probably be a good follow-up for that. I think for this, we were more interested in kind of the broader scope for it, but there were a lot of more finer detail points that potentially would be good follow-up points. So more narrowed view for phylogenetic diversity. It probably would have been helpful to look at seed mix composition, and then location for where those seeds are actually coming from, whether they're in Minnesota or for another area. So I do think that would potentially be a really good thing to look at in the future.
Dustin, when you're talking about planting by guild, would that be like all the rosids or all of the legumes, or?
Yeah, generally people would do something like cool season native, warm season native grasses, cool season non-legumes or non-legume forbs, legume forbs, and maybe a sedge if you can convince them to throw that into the C3 stuff.
Yeah.
So I'm thinking, I mean, they already kind of have that really over dispersed phylogeny idea in the way that they create seed mixes. And I think that maybe looking inside of those guilds to see if they're actually representing a lot of the natural phylogenetic diversity that happens within those guilds in remnant prairies, I think that would be fairly interesting.
Yeah.
I'm not sure if that's out there or not. It might be already out there.
Any other questions, anybody? Wait, thank you, Ainsley, so much for sharing your work. It was awesome to hear, and we'll be posting up this recording for folks. If anybody else wants to check it out, please contact us and we'll be able to send that out to folks. Thank you.
Thank you all very much.
Thank you.
Nice job, Ainsley.
Thank you.
Writing down some notes that Dustin was just talking about. Dustin works at the DNR. I know we got Randy and Tim still on the call here, but we'll be able to talk as a committee in just a bit.
Take a quick break.
Yeah, take a quick break. Ainsley, you can turn off the recording. Or maybe I can do that.